Well, good evening and welcome to everybody. Welcome to our regulars, and if you're a first timer this week, then welcome to you too. My name is Alan Friedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association, and I am again your MC for this evening. And tonight I'm joined by Michael Bird, my former co-host of Nothing Left for the evening. Good evening, Michael.
Good evening, Alan.
Nice to be back together.
And good evening, David, too.
So after escaping to Canberra last week, David Adler, President of the AJA, is back with us tonight. If there's any time at the end, he might want to tell us in a few words what happened in Canberra last week. But we are delighted to welcome our guest speaker tonight in Stan Goodenough, who we will introduce formally in a moment. And tonight we're going to be hearing about all the controversial issues from someone who lives in Israel and is right on our wavelength. And I will point out that Stan happens to be in the Czech Republic at the moment because as a tour guide, there's not too many tourists around Israel at the moment. The format will be, as usual, Michael and I will chat with Stan for about 30 minutes, at which point we will open up for questions from the audience. And as I always remind people, the best way to get our attention is to raise your hand electronically. And if you click on the participants icon down at the bottom, you'll see a little button that says raise hand, or if there isn't one of those, there's a green tick. Just let us know that you want to ask a question, and we take them as they come. We'll get to you shortly after about half an hour. The chat function is available as usual, and as usual, we always ask people to just stick to the night's topic. Okay, well, Stan Goodenough is a journalist, writer, speaker, and accredited tour guide in Israel. If you want, you can Google Zion Warrior Tours, Z-I-O-N, Warrior Tours, and he regularly visits Australia to speak to both Jewish and Christian audiences. Stan has been a friend of ours for many years, and Michael and I enjoyed his regular contributions to Nothing Left over the 5 years that we ran that radio program. And Stan was always generous enough to make time for us whenever he was in Australia. Michael and I have often marvelled at the friendship we received from the Christian Zionist community, and this has easily flowed on and expanded as we move from Nothing Left into the Australian Jewish Association. In fact, we've commented many times how we wish that some of our Jewish communal organisations were as friendly to and supportive of Israel as the Christian Zionists are. So it was with great pleasure that we're able to catch up again with Stan, this time on behalf of the AJA. Stan, good evening our time, and thanks for joining us. It's nice to see you again.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, Stan, we'll get to some of the issues shortly, but we can't sort of start without asking you about the Israeli election. It's obviously changing very quickly. Have you got any latest information on what's likely to happen?
It has literally been fluctuating through the night since the closing of the polls, and the first exit polls were broadcast at 10 p.m. Israeli time last night. The initial outlook or an expectation was that the nationalist camp, which is to say the Likud, with the other right-wing parties, Shas and Yamina as kingmaker, would be able to get 61 seats against the 59 seats of the left, let's say the center-left bloc, but seriously, it's a left-wing bloc. And then that number moved back and forth, putting the left side in front of the right side, and then back again. The latest that I've heard is that the breakaway Arab party that broke away from the Arab list, Ra'am, they were initially not able to get over the threshold with the initial projections. They are now over the threshold, at least they were when I last checked about half an hour ago. And that has pushed the Likud, or rather the national camp, Likud and Yamina, down to about 59 seats overall, raising the specter of a potentially a left-wing led or directed coalition, if they can even form a coalition. But it is super gridlock. It's pretty much the way it was after the last three cycles, as they're calling them. They're calling them election cycles now. And they're talking about the fifth cycle. They were already talking about October this year as the need for another election. It's really stymied, and well, all of us, depending on where we stand and how we view the importance of the leaning of the Israeli government, it's certainly for me, it's exasperating and distressing, a little bit worrying because of the unfriendly administration in the United States right now. And Israel really needs, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, I guess, but Israel needs, in my understanding, needs a strong nationalist-led government with a strong position on the sovereign land of Israel and against the Iranian threat, etc., to withstand the kinds of pressures that are already coming, full tilt actually, often below the radar screen, but coming from the United States. So anyway, it's there's no clarity now yet. They say by Friday morning they should have the final tallies in there. Some I heard 600,000, but I have to check whether that's accurate. So-called double enveloped votes that have to be counted from soldiers and others who couldn't get in. One issue that was possibly problematic, maybe have been a logistical thing. My son, who flew back on Sunday, he wanted to vote. He's in quarantine, and the system was supposed to provide a special taxi service for those in quarantine to be taxied to a separate polling booth so they could vote and then be taken back home. And he tried over and over again to reach these taxi companies. He couldn't get out the house. He couldn't go and vote. And the reports from Israel were that the quarantine election poll booths were all empty, that those people in quarantine were not getting through. Now, thousands of Israelis flew in over the last few days to vote. All of them would have to quarantine. Those that flew in this yesterday would have been able to vote at the airport, but the rest were in quarantine, and I don't know how many of them managed to get out to vote. So there are issues like that.
Okay. Michael, did you have any questions on that?
Yeah, that's a worrying concern, and I'm sure we're going to hear a bit more about that situation, about the quarantine issue, Stan. Before we leave the topic of the elections, how did Labor go? And I think you touched on the joint Arab list or the extension of that. So particularly with Labor, what's happening with them? How did they go?
They got in. I think that there was fluctuating polls again between 7 and 8 seats. I think at one point I saw they were down to 6 and then back up again. The party leader, Michaeli, she spoke briefly, invoking the legacy of the assassinated Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and saying that she said they murdered Rabin, but they didn't murder his path. And we're still here, and Labor's here to stay. And I would imagine, well, no, I'm not going to imagine, but yes, they're in at the moment. They're in with, I think, 7 seats.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay. All right, Stan. I mentioned in my introduction, just before we get into some of the issues, I mentioned that we regard the Christian Zionists as great friends of Israel. But in case some of the audience may not be completely familiar of how the relationship works, and maybe wondering if there is any attempt to convert Jews away from Judaism, could you outline the Christian Zionist approach that you're involved with to Israel and the Jewish people?
Sure. In my personal story is that I was raised in an evangelical Christian home in Protestant Christianity, where Israel was a non-entity, not relevant to my young faith. It wasn't taught. I never heard any preacher say that Israel was no longer important to God, that Israel was no longer the chosen nation or anything like that. But in essence, that was the message that was somehow conveyed by simply not being addressed. And so Israel's significance to my faith and Israel's significance on the world stage today was not neither of those were relevant in my growing up. But my parents were Philo-Semitic, and my mom played Hebraic music around the house, and I even learned to sing in Hebrew before I knew what I was singing about. And I developed a desire to go to Israel out of apartheid South Africa, where there weren't many countries that we could visit, but there was the kibbutz experience, and I wanted to get there and put my feet on the ground and learn about Israel firsthand. By that time, in my young adulthood, I was growing more and more aware of not only that Israel the nation and the people and the land, that Israel was the source, the origin, the foundation of my Christian faith, but that Israel was still just as relevant in the purposes of the Almighty as that nation has always been. Not only that, but that as a Christian who gets everything that I hold most dear to myself from the Jewish people, the history of Christianity, the way that the Christian world frightfully, devastatingly abused the Jewish people down through the centuries, wherever they went, and leaving a legacy that is deep in the minds of many of my Jewish friends who, when they meet me, they are suspicious about my agenda. They do wonder, you know, what's in it for you? Why did I move to Israel? Why did I eventually stay there? And my explanation, if I give it like that, is I have everything that I hold dear comes from this nation. It is it's incredible in its history. It has an incredible future and destiny. And as a Christian, I want to stand with the Jewish people as they go into their destiny. I want to stand between Israel and an Israel-hating world, and the majority of the world is an Israel-hating world. And I want the Jewish people to know that I have nothing but love and appreciation for them, a belief in an incredible respect for them and for their past, and a belief in their future, and that in whatever way I can, I want to help stand with them into that future, in whatever form that might take, encouraging my friends, my Jewish friends, with the promise of their future in times when there's a great crisis in Israel, when there are threats of violence that are escalating against Israel. I've had the opportunity to express my confidence in Israel's security, because Israel's security is not in the hands ultimately of any man, but in the hands of the one who watches over Israel and who doesn't slumber or sleep, and who has made promises to Israel. So Christian Zionists, and I'm in that stream, Christian Zionists have understood and do understand that Israel remains a unique nation. It is the window through which we first view God, the Almighty. It is the nation that has taught us about who He is, and the faithfulness of God in history to Israel through all the ups and downs of the Jewish people's history is a great bulwark and strengthener of my own faith, because I believe in this Almighty God who keeps His promises, and He has kept them to the people of Israel, and He exhorts us. And actually, no Christian who believes the Bible, no Christian who believes the Bible can stand in any way in opposition to Israel, can do anything but support, comfort, encourage, and stand alongside the nation of Israel. And if at any time in history that would have been true, tragically, it was very seldom the practice of Christianity. But in this, the last half of the last century, up until now, there is a growing awareness in Christianity, primarily evangelical Christianity around the world, that not only do we have this incredible debt that we owe the Jewish people in terms of what we've got positively from them, not only do we have this horrific history that we need to acknowledge and shun and condemn of Christian anti-Semitism, but we also have a nation that is thriving, growing, blossoming, and yet that continues to be hated and condemned universally by the world. And we are to stand with Israel, and we do as Christian Zionists, and we have no hidden agenda. We are not out to convert Jews to Christianity. Well, I'll say that for myself. I am not on any agenda. My support for Israel is without there's no ties attached to it, and it's just, I'm with you. I've got so much from you, and I want to be with you. And if I can be with you, as long as possible, after living in Israel for nearly 30 years, I only got my residency just over a year ago, so it took a while. But I'm very grateful and humbled to be able to call Israel my home as a non-Jew.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And I must say that in the years that I've been involved in Israel advocacy, and I'm sure Michael will agree, we've never felt anything other than warmth and friendship from the Christian Zionist groups. And And you've just been fantastic friends, so long may it continue. So thank you for that. Michael,
I'll double down on that. I mean, if anybody ever asked me to convert to Christianity, I'd say thanks, but no thanks. Although we're the most hated people on earth, I'm quite happy being a Jew. Stan, there's many Christian evangelicals. America in particular has got very many millions, and they're very influential in Washington. I think Mike Pence is a evangelical Christian. Is there more than one branch? Like, is there different types of evangelical Christians? Is there one group, or is there different type, and they've got slightly different outlooks? How does it work?
You know, Michael, I got my tour guiding license at a Jewish college in Jerusalem, and I was in a room of 40 students. 38 were Jews, and there were 2 of us who were not. And my fellow students asked me to try and explain, well, how does this all work in Christianity? There's Catholicism and Protestantism, and then there's evangelicals, and then there's Pentecostals, and how does this all fit together? Do you get evangelicals in the Catholic Church? Please explain. And my response was, well, if you can explain to me the difference between the different sects and branches and streams in Judaism, I'll give it a shot trying to explain to you the different streams in Christianity. Look, in basic terms, an evangelical, as opposed to an evangelist is a missionary. An evangelical is somebody who believes in the evangel, which is the gospel. In other words, he's a believer in Jesus. He is a Christian. He's a believer. He believes that the entire Bible, that is to say the Jewish Tanakh and the New Testament, that it is all the word of God, and that everything that's written in it is what guides him in life. And whether he's a Methodist or an Anglican or a Baptist, he will hold up the Bible, and I've got one right here in front of me. He'll hold it up and say, I believe in this book and what it says. And you cannot say you believe in the Bible and be anti-Israel. You just cannot. You cannot say you base your life on the Bible and have anti-Semitism in your bloodstream and anti-Israel attitudes in your heart. The two don't go together. The Bible, first of all, it teaches us non-Jews about Israel, and then it teaches us about our relationship with Israel in terms of where our faith comes from, the roots of it, and where it's going, and the restoration of the Jews to their land. And by the way, I'm going to have the temerity to say to all the dear Jewish people on this Zoom that if you're not in the land of Israel, you're not in exile, you're not in diaspora, you're in captivity, right, according to the Tanakh, and you need to get out of prison and come home to Israel. That's what the Bible says. That's what the Almighty says. Your home is there. Whatever the stream of Christianity, if it is Bible believing, and it will not question, and it will not betray or deny or go against what's written in the Bible, there you will have your evangelical stream. And out in that stream, not all of them, because they don't all have the teaching, there's a lack of education. We are not so much taught what's known as replacement theology in so many words as it is conveyed to us in evangelicals as well, that because Israel did not accept Jesus as Messiah, they ceased to be God's chosen people, and Gentiles or Christians became the new chosen people of God. And that's heresy. It is heresy that calls God a liar. The Almighty has said that as long as the sun and the moon and the stars hang in the sky, Israel will remain a nation before him, and his promises to Israel are, of course, irrevocable. So that evangelical, you'll find evangelicals in many denominations, in many streams, but you won't say that is your denomination. You're not an evangelical by your denomination, but in the denomination you're in, usually Protestant, you will be an evangelical. I don't know if that's any help at all.
That's good. Okay, let's get into some of the hot issues. Michael, do you want to start?
Yes, we've got a breather from the now disproven two-state solution, Stan, during the Trump years, but this now seems to have been revived by the Biden, I call it the Biden squad administration. How do you view this situation?
Look, the two-state solution is, there are two things that I consider the two-state solution to be. The two-state solution is, first of all, an internationally motivated effort to rob the Jewish people of their land. That's what it is. It's to create in the most important parts, the most historically valuable parts of the Jewish national home, an enemy state. At the expense of the indigenous people who are the Jewish people. It is immoral. It is on every level, it is bankrupt. There is no argument you can make for a two-state solution, whether it is Israel's ability to defend itself when it's confined, as the newspapers were reporting this morning, to the 9-mile wide or the 13-kilometer wide narrow waistline between what would be Palestine and Netanya, for example, with no strategic depth left to Israel, the high ground given over to those who get great joy out of firing rockets into Israeli cities, as they tried from Gaza again during the voting yesterday. It is historically bankrupt because the people to whom the world insists Israel should surrender half of its land are not a nation. They have no national history there. They have no artifacts, no historical, archaeological proofs of a previous existence, neither in Judea-Samaria nor in Jerusalem. They have no claim that they can base on any kind of historical documentation as a nation to that land. It's not the world's land. I'm in the Sudetenland, or I'm near the Sudetenland. I'm in the Czech Republic right now. And not far from here, back in the 1930s, the powers of the day told the Czech people, you have to give away land for peace. Give away to Adolf Hitler the Sudetenland, and we'll avoid another world war. The whole idea of land for peace there's no precedent for it that it works. And when it comes to other nations telling an indigenous people that they have to give away their land, I mean, I know in Australia, the indigenous history and sensitivities to the First Nations and the Aboriginal people are very, very finely tuned. It's a big issue there. Can you imagine? I'm just thinking this off the top of my head. Imagine if the world powers or the superpowers or the rest of the international community said to the Aboriginal Australians, you need to surrender all of the land that you have, get out, get in canoes, go somewhere else, leave the land. It now belongs to another people who until 120 years ago had no national history there. And I'm not trying to draw too many parallels, but to show the chutzpah, the nerve, in fact, it's criminal that Israel, the Jewish people, after they have barely survived, and I really want to stress this point because every year we hear the pledge never again coming out of the mouths of leaders in Europe and Australia and the United States as they stand and they bow their heads in memory of those who were slaughtered, the Jews who were slaughtered in the Holocaust. They say never again. And then this nation that dragged itself out of the death camps back to their original land, which no other nation had ever owned, and brought miraculously the land back to life, instead of it being a haven for the Jews, is actually the most dangerous place on earth, in a sense, for the Jewish people, because everybody around them hates them, and the international community condemns them left, right, and center. It's criminal the way the world tries to impose on the Jews this state, and I haven't even begun to talk about the makeup of the people to whom the world wants to give the state. The people who brought awareness of their so-called cause to the world stage by hijacking airplanes and introducing the world to international terrorism. Until they did that in the 1970s, nobody even knew there was a Palestinian cause. And everybody's sold out to it. Every single nation, Australia as well. Everyone supports the two-state solution. Donald Trump was a breath of fresh air. He was totally... he went against all this And you know what? He was right. He was right morally. He was right historically. He was right in terms of what's fair and what's just. He was right in terms of international law when he got Mike Pompeo to say the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria are not illegal under international law. He was right. He was telling truth. He was telling truth when he said the Golan Heights was always Israel's in antiquity, and it's never, except for a few short years, been Syria's, and Syrians only used it to attack the Jewish communities. He was right. Israel should keep the Golan Heights, and he was dead right when he said Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, and moved his embassy there. I mean, he came and he's gone, but please God, in my heart, he's not gone forever. Yeah. But Joe Biden, or you said the Biden squad, I say the Biden Harris, yeah, well, whatever. Anyway, the new administration, yeah, they're just setting the clock back, and they're doing it really, really quickly. And there are some very disturbing events taking place, even just the day before yesterday. Can't remember the source now. I'll go back and look for it in a minute if I need to. But apparently, beginning in January, discussions were held with the Jordanians about permitting American troops to be based on Jordanian soil. And 2 days ago, the agreement was signed, bypassing the Jordanian parliament, signed by the king, and allowing American troops, armed American soldiers, to in fact be based in Jordan, which is between Israel and Iraq, which is under threat from Iran, and Iran itself, of course. And this right at a time when Israel is saying there's no way that the United States should go back to the agreement with Iran. There's no way that they should go back to that agreement. And Joe Biden is saying, well, we want to get back into the agreement, and is discussing, as I'm sure you know, I don't know if you're going to go into this today, but realigning the entire Middle East away from the Sunni Arab alliance that Donald Trump established, and cozying up to Iran again, and actually at the expense of the Sunni Arab alliance and at Israel's expense. The two-state solution has been proven. If anybody was a real believer in the two-state solution, back when it was called a few other things, the Oslo Agreement, the roadmap to peace, the Annapolis version of it, the two-state agreement, or the two-state solution has no way. There's no way it works. Everything has been tried from when Israel gave away everything in the beginning, surrendered territory, allowed the Palestinians to be armed, and began to actually force its own people to leave their homes. Israel has bent over backwards to actually try and meet the demands of the world that a two-state solution should be imposed or should come into being. And the other side, which does not want a two-state solution, but a removal of Israel, has never really cooperated in any way whatsoever. Yeah. If anything, should tell the Biden administration that the two-state solution is a dead-end road, then the Palestinian Arabs and their behavior should, yes, in my opinion.
Yeah, well said. Stan, just to develop that a little bit, the Palestinian narrative has been one of an indigenous people that's been dispossessed from their traditional homeland by the colonizing Jews. Now, from where I sit here in captivity in the diaspora, I just wonder whether Israel has been active enough in challenging this, because it just seems to be such a no-brainer. Has Israel been on the front foot enough about this issue?
In a word, no. In a word, no. I think it was Shimon Peres, the late Shimon Peres, who went on the record many years ago now as saying that Israel doesn't need to really invest in hasbara, in public relations. Look, there is the biggest press corps the biggest international press corps in the world, apart from Washington D.C., is situated in Jerusalem, and they churn out a huge amount of material that supports the Arab narrative, which you've just outlined there. And it's interesting, it's changed a little bit, because I think Time magazine ran a piece in the late 90s. Time magazine, no, sorry, excuse me, forgive me, sorry, Time magazine. I've got issues with Time magazine, but this isn't that one. National Geographic ran a piece, a feature about the Palestinians as being descended from the Philistines. And that was milked for all it was worth by the Arabs until Saeb Erekat, I think it was him, an advisor, senior advisor to PLO Chief Arafat, said, oh, no, we are descendants of the Canaanites, which means we preceded the Israelites, which means well, I mean, it doesn't take, I'm no scholar. You don't need to be a scholar. The evidence is glaring that that's all fabricated nonsense. The Arabs, there are a lot of Arab nations. There are a lot of Arab states, but there's really one Arab nation, and they come from Arabia, and they are the occupiers in the Middle East. And all the countries that today exist in what was the Ottoman Empire, all the Arab states, they're all brand new. They have far less legitimacy, historically speaking, than the tiny little Jewish state that was carved out or half carved out, thanks to Mr. Churchill, half dismembered. But no one questions no one tries to, of course, to delegitimize Jordan or Syria or any of the Arab states that were kind of crafted by the British at the end of World War I. So there is no evidence, there's no historical documented evidence, and as I mentioned earlier, there's no archaeological evidence, no proof whatsoever of a Palestinian nation in that land whose roots go back. Mm-hmm. And you may have read the remarkable work by a woman by the name of Joan Peters, who it's from time immemorial. I think she's passed now, but she set out to write a book in support of the quote unquote poor Palestinians. And all of her research, which took her into the archives from London to Moscow, throughout the Middle East and parts of the British Empire, all her research led her to the absolute conviction that the Palestinian nation is a fraudulent people. They're not a people, they have no national history there. But the journalists who gathered together at the American colony and trade their angles on the stories that they're going to report on out of Israel, collaborate, all of them, on supporting the Arab narrative. And Israel, hey, sorry, I better not say anything to stand on your feet, Alan and Michael, because I did in the studio one day. Will you forgive me if I do this?
Yeah, of course.
That was our first time I sat with the Nothing Left radio program, and one or both of you, and I'll leave it up to you to decide who it was, referred to a place called the West Bank. And I said to you, and we were live, and I said to you, I'm deeply sorry to offend you, but I can't understand why a Jew would use a term that was coined that actually robs you of your historical connection to the land. The Jerusalem Post, which under David Bar-Ilan, a personal friend of mine way back, before he became advisor to Mr. Netanyahu, was a good newspaper that stood on Zionist values. Today, it's a left-wing rag. The Times of Israel, David Horowitz, they're horribly left-wing, anti-Netanyahu, anti-Trump, anti-settlements, Arutz Sheva is about the only voice we get in Israel that tries, and an incredible organization called the Women in Green, Women for Israel's Tomorrow, who, two women, I remember them banging pots and pans, walking down the road outside the president's residence in Jerusalem after the signing of the Oslo Accords, saying this can't happen. And just a handful of women, not political people, they are responsible for the birth of the sovereignty movement, which today has incredible support throughout the land. So many Israelis today support the effort to extend Israeli law, Jewish sovereignty over Judea and Samaria, and finalize and put an end to this lying land grab. But of course, I don't know about the Hasbara failings of the foreign ministry in Israel, but what about the incredible land grab that's happening in Israel, in the heart of Judea and Samaria right now? You drive through Judea and Samaria, and all you see are mushrooming cities, empty apartment blocks by the tens of thousands, I'm not exaggerating, or huge mansions and beautifully designed and manicured park cities for the Palestinian Arabs in Area C, which is supposed to be an area that was under the Oslo Agreement, was supposed to be entirely under Israeli control. The Palestinian Arabs were to have no right to build there. They're building en masse. Go to the website of Regavim, and they track and they film, and the Israeli government is doing nothing to stop this. Fact, you know what's a Zionist trick? Was you guys, was the Jews who went into Palestine and moved around through Palestine late at night and put up the tower and stockade settlements and established a Jewish presence, because they knew where Jews put their feet down, they'll be able to hold onto the land. Well, the Palestinian Arabs have learned that lesson well, and they're putting their feet down everywhere. And the Israeli government's doing this much that I'm aware of to stop it. It's disheartening, to put it mildly.
Yeah, yeah. Look, there's lots more that Michael and I could ask you, Stan, but we'll go to the audience questions. I've got Ron, Jeff, and Dennis. Just before we go to Ron, there is a written question from Elaine, and she's asking about Reverend Stephen Sizer in the UK. Now, that name doesn't mean anything to me, but can you tell us a little bit about him?
Okay, in an indirect way, I think it was in 2009 or 2010 that a meeting, a conference was held in Bethlehem. It was called Christ at the Checkpoint. I think that was the name of the conference, Christ at the Checkpoint. It was and this is where obviously we realize just how big a job we have on our hands, us evangelicals. It was an evangelical conference. It's still ongoing, although not in Israel anymore, and I'll try and explain why in a moment. It was hosted by the Bethlehem Bible College, and it brought in clerics. At the top of the guest list was Stephen Sizer, who is an Anglican priest with a parish in England, and who has quite a reach through his books and through, I think, radio programs. I'm not sure of his whole CV, but he has been promoting Palestinianism and condemning Zionism, and he's very anti-Semitic, outspokenly anti-Semitic, propagating lies about the Jewish people, propagating lies about Israel as a state, as a nation state. And he was the I think the eminent speaker at this the first edition of this Christ at the Checkpoint conference. Was a very small affair. It was initially held every other year. It grew in number. It became a hate fest, an anti-Israel hate fest, as people flew into Ben Gurion Airport and then were driven through the wall around Bethlehem and were given for the next 7 days, I guess it was, filled with poisonous anti-Semitism as Christians in a Christian evangelical gathering. And Stephen Sizer was very big behind this. He is in, look, this is the shameful history of our Christian past. Mainstream Christianity from the 2nd century in the Common Era, mainstream Christianity has embraced this heresy that God is fed up and done with the Jews because the Jews killed Christ, which is obviously one of the worst lying charges leveled against them, because of course it wasn't Jews who killed Jesus, it was Romans anyway. But the Jews rejected Christ, and so God rejected them, and so we, the church, Christendom, are now the new people of God. That has been the broad river of Christianity for the last 2,000 years, and until today it remains the broad river of Christianity. Go to the World Council of Churches, all the congregations, all the denominations that are part of that group, very anti-Semitic, very anti-Israel, and Stephen Sizer represents them.
Okay. Thanks, Stan. Okay, let's get to the audience. Ron, you're first off, so please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hear me?
Yep. Fire.
Hi, good evening, Stan. My name is Ron Ankenam McKennis. Nice to hear from you.
Your accent.
Thank you. You have, in a de facto way, you've repudiated the idea, the concept of eternal witness that was formulated by church founder Augustine, eternal witness, whereby Jews would be condemned to pariah status, always wandering, never to be loved, and never to have their own home, which was why they wandered throughout Europe. And it's been transformed onto this eternal witness concept onto the state of Israel by mainstream European countries and Christianity. How can evangelicals like yourself formally repudiate and try and reclaim a different kind of a narrative from early church founder Augustine, you know, which is also underpinned by people like Shikani and Tutu and people like that. But there are people like Clive Mashishi and the African Christian Zionists as well, and also Afro-American Zionist churches. How can you connect and formally try and get this idea of eternal witness repudiated? Because that's where it comes from. So Israel is the pariah state of the United Nations, for instance, you know, with chapter 7s and all that kind of stuff. But that is where it originally comes from. How can it be formally repudiated? What can you do about that?
Ron, I wish I had a very optimistic and promising answer for you. The fact is, I don't really. And certainly, individual church leaders and pastors and others in different Christian organizations like the International Christian Embassy, Bridges for Peace, Christians for Israel. They have publicly repudiated all these charges against the Jewish people, all these heretical concepts and ideas. The authority that they hold up in repudiating is the Bible. Once again, the fact that the Jewish people lost their land, lost their temple, lost Jerusalem, that 2/3 of them were decimated by the Romans and the rest were scattered into the world to wander the world, has nothing to do with Christianity or with the time of Jesus. It has to do with Moses, who warned just before he died on Mount Nebo. He warned the Israelites that if they were unfaithful to God, God would curse them, and if they continued in their unfaithfulness, eventually the land would spew them out, and they would wander the world, and they would live in fear, and everybody would hate them. That's something that the God of Israel told his beloved Israel would happen to them, and it did. And because that's the history of Israel, it was the history leading up to the time of Christ, and it's been the history since then of their wandering. It's not a Christian teaching; it's a Tanakh truth that the Jews out of their land were experiencing God's disfavor because of their unfaithfulness as a nation. But God, the same God who said that they would be driven out, promised that he would watch over them, that he would not leave them, abandon them, and that he would gather them back and keep them in their land as a shepherd keeps his sheep, and that he will rejoice over them to do them good. So what I guess what people like the early church fathers and others who fed on the early milk of Christian anti-Semitism and spread it through the early Gentile Christian world, they came up with their own theology and their own reasons for the misfortune of the people of Israel. To repudiate it, certainly we can. As my wife, when she was a young woman, she was in Spain the year when Christians in Spain were remembering the expulsion, the mass expulsion by Ferdinand and Isabella of the Jewish people from Spain. And churches in different parts of Spain back in 1991 were holding public meetings where they were acknowledging the awful crime that their country 400 years before had committed against the Jewish people, and begging forgiveness. Although of course that's a whole different discussion about asking forgiveness for people who are no longer here. But nonetheless, they rejected what their forefathers had done. There are in Christian Zionism, in Christian Zionism across the different organizations and in churches that do hold to the Bible, there is a rejection, a complete rejection of the lying charge that the Jews are Christ killers who deserve to be punished and hounded and wander the world for their sin. So, but when I say that I don't have a very optimistic answer, it's still mainstream Christendom that is where I was growing up as a boy. Some of them outspokenly, like Tutu, outspokenly supporting this liberation theology, which is also heretical, and others just in ignorance, just because they weren't told. So we're trying to tell them. Bridges for Peace, and I've noticed that one of their representatives is here, was maybe left, They have a whole arm, or part of their ministry, and I was on their board for 12 years, is to educate Christians about the truth about what we have done to the Jewish people as Christianity, and in fact what we should have been doing, and what we do today, which is to stand with you.
Good on you. Just a reminder, please keep the questions brief. Jeff, your turn. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Am I on?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Ron should actually edit half of what he says and delete the other half, because he actually repeats himself and doesn't seem to realize that. And not only that, he embarrassed you. There's no reason for that. So here's my question, nice and short. Is it reasonable to hope that the Harris administration will so overreach in their evil acts and mishaps that they will be unelectable in 2 and 4 years' time? Short and sweet, Ron, that's how to do it.
Okay. So the question is the Biden-Harris administration doing damage to themselves? What do you think, Stan?
Look, I think they're going to do. I think they're going to do a lot more damage to Israel before their 4 years are up. At the pace with which they're moving, and the program that they have in mind, and the people that they're talking to, I think we will. Those of us non-Americans, like myself, who were very much hoping that Donald Trump would win another 4 years, because he managed to do so much good in 4 years. He basically began reversing the track that America had been on under the previous administrations, whether they were Republican or Democrat. But Biden is picking up. In fact, I think Obama is probably behind there somewhere, pulling the strings, picking up where Obama left off. They've had 4 years to plan for this, and they are racing ahead very quickly. And they have massive popular support, yes, depending on where you stand on the whole thing about the fraudulent election. 70 million people voted for Trump, but many tens of millions voted for Biden, if you believe that or not. The trend in America is to support the policy and the worldview of the Democrats. And I'm not so sure, unless they do something that I can't foresee at the moment, but certainly they could, because when you play with fire, you're going to get burned, and they're playing with Iran, and they're trying to get back into bed with Europe, which is basically coming apart at the seams at the moment. I mean, there are a lot of other things that could happen, not to talk about China and where that could all go. But I don't see at this point, I wouldn't be able to say with any confidence that they would be, that they're setting themselves to be unelectable in 4 years' time. I think there's a good chance, if chance is what it's all about, that the policies that they are now pursuing, they could pursue for another 4 after this.
So yeah. Okay, Dennis and then Debbie. So Dennis, please unmute yourself.
Okay. The Abraham Accords have shown that Arab countries are now prepared to have relations with Israel, and they have left behind them the Palestinian cause. I mean, it was one or the other, effectively. The facts on the ground in what the rest of the world calls the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, is that there are now 600,000 Jews living in Judea and Samaria, and it's growing rapidly. Given that it's quite possible that Naftali Bennett will be a part of a right-wing government in Israel, if the exit polls that I'm reading at the moment are to be believed, what do you think would happen if Israel declares sovereignty under Naftali Bennett of the West Bank and calls it Judea and Samaria?
Hey, Dennis, thanks for the question. Just at the moment, we were discussing, I think, before the meeting got officially underway, just the total unpredictability of the outcome of this election right now. As Bennett and his Yamina party were, according to the polls leading up to the elections, were looking at 12, 13 seats. They ended up with 7 or 8, which means they are potentially a kingmaker, that if Netanyahu can put together the other numbers, and he just needs the extra 7 seats to push himself over 60 to 61, Yamina would be a part of that. But because Yamina and Bennett only have 6, 7, maybe 8 seats, their Bennett's ability to influence or to pressure or to demand any kind of premiership or partial or rotating premiership. I think that if there ever was any, and Netanyahu was very clear from the start that he wasn't interested in rotating with Bennett, I think that's a very, very, at the moment, it seems very unlikely that Bennett's going to assume that position. Bennett is very strong on sovereignty, and as a minister, potentially in the new government, if that comes about, hopefully, please God, he would be able to bring the whole sovereignty question much closer to the top of the to-do list of the new administration in Israel. And there is widespread national support now for sovereignty over Judea and Samaria. The new administration in Washington, of course, is now totally opposed to that, whereas the previous one was giving quite a lot of room. And when it came to the Abraham Accords, I have to say personally that everybody says it didn't cost Israel anything. It cost the United States some F-35s. It didn't cost Israel anything. It was basically peace for peace, not land for peace. But there was land for peace in this, that the promise held out by the deal of the century, where Donald Trump said he would basically allow Israel to extend sovereignty over parts of, as a first step, Judea and Samaria, that all came to a dead screeching halt. And the Abraham Accords came, in a sense, in their place, in their stead. And Israel had to let sovereignty go in order to clinch the agreements with the Arab Emirates, United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain and the other states. Now, the Abraham Accords now, I just want to applaud, because it's incredible that there are these, that these countries that for so long, that there was a wall-to-wall anti-Israel Arab world is no longer true. The Middle East is very, very different. And yes, the Palestinian veto, as it's called, has been shown up to be false. The Palestinian Arabs' insistence that, and the Arab states' insistence that the Palestinian question first be dealt with, that a state of Palestine first be created before any Arab state would recognize Israel or normalize with Israel, that's now history. It's not going to happen that way. However, Biden is trying to reverse that. And he's even turning the screws on the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain to begin to level demands in Israel's direction about the two-state solution, to get them on board at the potential risk of rupturing these new relationships. So there's some pretty dastardly stuff happening. At the moment, I'm not particularly, just looking at it horizontally, I'm not particularly optimistic that that the international community has lost its commitment to the two-state solution. I think that pressure is going to build on Israel again, and I don't know what it's going to do in regards to the Abraham Accords. I don't know how that's going to play out. It depends on the government.
Okay, now we're running up to time. Debbie, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, when the State of Israel was formed, as a Jewish state, they had to assure the United Nations that they would look after the non-Jewish population, as not just the Jews. Now, what do you suggest should be the ideal solution for this, in lieu of a two-state solution, like for the Arabs under Palestine control?
Right, so going quickly back, thanks, Debbie. Going quickly back to the Balfour Declaration, although it was originally just a statement of government intent of England, of Great Britain, it did stress that the support for a national home for the Jewish people had to ensure that national home had to ensure that it protected the basic civic rights of the other inhabitants of the land. It said nothing about national rights. It said nothing about offering them any kind of autonomy, just that they would not be oppressed, become a second-class oppressed minority in the new Jewish national home. With the creation of the state in 1948, leading up to that creation, the different Zionist leaders held out, from Weizmann, Ben-Gurion, held out their hands to the Arabs over and over again and said, let's find a way to do this together. And increasingly, of course, the new spawned Palestinian Arab movement would channel Arab rejection and hatred of this new Jewish state, or this reborn Jewish state, to the place where all the Arabs that were not actually Israeli citizens after the creation of the state, those who didn't flee, those who stayed behind, became citizens, where the rest were united in their hatred of Israel. But the Arabs inside Israel today, they live they're Palestinians. Their brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers and uncles and aunts are in the Palestinian Arab side. They are Israeli Arabs, and they enjoy the highest standard of living, the only free democratic country in the entire Middle East, in the entire Arab world. They love being part of the Jewish state, no matter what comes out of their mouths, because it benefits them in so many ways. And Israel is not a racist state. It is not an anti-Arab state. So the Arabs who live inside Israel are protected by Israel. They're represented at every level. They are equal under the law. You've heard the charge that Israel is an apartheid state. Well, the South Africans on this Zoom and myself, who grew up in apartheid, know that there couldn't be a bigger lie, virtually, except perhaps the one that says that the Palestinians are a nation. And so as far as the Arabs who live under Israeli sovereignty are concerned, they're taken care of. The other Arabs, their family members who are in the Palestinian Arab group, if you like, now what is the solution for them? Well, I know this isn't going to go down well at all, and everybody's going to say it's undoable, but actually it's just a matter of international law. The Arab world, the Palestinian Arabs are Arabs. The Arab world is huge and extremely rich. It has a lot of room, and it has a lot of wealth, and it's the natural cultural environment for the Palestinian Arabs to live in and thrive in. And they could, if the Arabs were told, if the pressure was taken off Israel to find a solution for a problem that Israel did not create, and was put on the Arab states to find a solution for the problem that they did create, and they were told, this is your problem, you caused this, you take care of it, we'll help you, we'll stand with you, the international community, but it's up to you to resolve. The Palestinians are suffering because of the Arabs, not because of the Jews. And it's totally wrong. And it's sad that I mean, I know I just, that's the thing, I have this admiration for the Jewish worldview, and the love of humanity that they express, and their desire to share everything that they come up with and that they invent and that they can do to improve all of mankind, to be Or Goyim. And at the same time, I think sometimes I just wish they could stand a bit more strongly on their rights and not give in, and not give in to the lie, the guilt trip that's constantly put on Israel. You've got to solve the problem. You caused the problem. It's not Israel's fault that there's a Palestinian issue. And Israel, despite the fact, I mean, I've talked forever on this issue, but maybe I've made my point.
Stan, thank you. Look, we have come up to time. I want to thank you for joining us. Look, we really only touched the tip of the iceberg with you today. We're going to have you back again at some point, and we would love to do that. I must tell you that since we first met you, I now only talk about Judea and Samaria and not the West Bank. So thank you for setting me straight on that. Stan, thanks so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to catch up with you again. We do look forward to seeing you back in Australia, so whenever that's going to happen, and we'd love to catch up with you in real life. Michael, do you have anything that you want to add?
Yeah, look, Stan, it was great catching up with you again, even though this time it's not in person. However, I just want to say on a personal note, and I'm saying it on a personal note, how much I appreciate having our wonderful Christian Zionist friends on side, and the amazing work by way of Israel Advocacy and fighting for our Jewish human rights that you and your colleagues around the world, particularly in Israel and America, and here in Australia, it's a pity that the majority of Australian Jews are not really aware of the behind-the-scenes proactive work that our Christian Zionist friends are doing, lobbying in Canberra, lobbying with mainstream Australians for Israel. And if only our progressive left Jewish community would be as unconditionally loyal to Israel and the Jewish cause as you and your friends are, Stan. So I just want to say thanks once again, and it's a real privilege to know you.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you.
May I wish you, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. And may I wish you all Chag Pesach Sameach, and may you be delivered once and for all, and may the Almighty bless Israel with shalom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stan. I'll just hand back to David for a little bit of a final wrap-up. Over to you, David.
Okay, look, thank you very much, Stan and Michael and Alan for hosting the program so well. Really, we're up to time, so I'll just make clear the very special event that we have coming up next week. Now, I'm sure this won't be controversial at all that we've got Mark Latham as our guest next week. But seriously, if you're into political correctness, don't tune in, because you won't find any next week. And we're going to be confronting some of the very blunt and very controversial political and social values issues with none other than Mark Latham next week. And I expect that'll be a very big event. And finally, as we always do, if anyone here is not yet supporting AJA, here are the 3 things that we call upon you to do. Join the email list, because social media is becoming less reliable, and you can just go to the website jewishassociation.org.au and subscribe for free. Make sure you like and follow the AJA Facebook page. And of course, we want everyone to assist us tangibly by becoming a member and making a donation. So back to you, Alan, and thank you.
Okay, thanks, David. Thanks, everybody. Thanks again, Stan and Michael. So until we see you all again next week, from me, it's good night to you all. Bye for now.